Welcome to SB&M is Here, the State Bar of New Mexico's official podcast. In this series, we'll discuss topics such as professional development, tools of the legal trade, and mental and professional well-being. Connecting the legal community across New Mexico, SB&M is here. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to SB&M is Here. This is Morgan Pettit, Member Services Manager and Podcast Producer. So I know I start every episode with how thrilled I am. I guess you can say I'm perpetually excited to provide you new types of content and information. But for this episode, I think it truly adds a new layer of excitement to the podcast series because we'll learn about a new chapter in New Mexico's history, and that is the legalization of cannabis. In this episode, we'll hear from members of our own Cannabis Law Section and the Executive Director of the Cannabis Chamber of Commerce. They are covering the wide scope of House Bill 2 of the 2021 New Mexico Special Legislative Session. So Carlos, feel free to take it away, and we're excited to learn.
Morgan, thank you for that introduction. I want to welcome everyone to the Cannabis Law Section's podcast on New Mexico's cannabis legalization. Very excited, very pumped up. My name is Carlos Martinez. I'm the chairperson and founder of the Cannabis Law Section. Also, today's host, I have two great guests with me today. One is a current member on the board of directors for the Cannabis Law Section. He's also a former presenter at last year's CLE, a fantastic cannabis law attorney, and probably arguably one of the best beards in the law game today, Mr. Brett Phelps. Thank you, Brett, for coming with us today.
Hey, thanks for having me here, Carlos. Glad to be doing it.
Awesome. And then also with me, we have the Executive Director of the New Mexico Cannabis Chamber of Commerce, played an instrumental role, I believe, in helping this legislation go through the special session. A highly mediocre golfer, but a very good friend, Mr. Ben Lewinger. Thanks, Ben.
Thanks. Good morning, everybody. I'm also here for Brett's beard and for nothing else.
So New Mexico's going recreational, finally. It's been a long time coming. I'll be honest, I didn't think that it was going to make it, especially after it stalled in the regular session. But lo and behold, the Brain Trust in Santa Fe were able to get it done. Very thankful for that. Ben, what are your first thoughts and reactions on the new legislation?
I'm excited. I think it was a coming together of lots of really good ideas, lots of hard work from the executive branch and from our legislators. And like you said, Carlos, I'm pumped. I think this is the critical first step where we can really start to build out this industry. So I'm excited.
Fantastic. Brett, same question to you. First thoughts and reactions on this new legislation.
I am thrilled. Yeah, I think it's fantastic. This is why I became a lawyer, was to work on cannabis legalization. Started, up at the Roundhouse, lobbying on these issues back in law school. Have watched over the years as the conversation has kind of shifted, as the growing acceptance, with the new legislators that came in this year. I was really hopeful for the chances. It was a little disappointing to see how it went down at the end of the regular session, but lo and behold, they got it done. I was really, it's kind of cool to say that we called a special session, brought our legislature back after they went home. They brought them all back to work on this one specific issue, so that was, it's cool to see, and was really happy to see it happen. I like a lot of the components that are in the bill, both for individuals as well as for the industry. So I am pumped, give a lot of credit to Representative Javier Martinez, who's been working on this issue for years, as well as a ton of other people up there at the legislature who have really made it happen. Thanks to Ben for his advocacy efforts up there, and everybody else that worked to get it done. But yeah, I'm excited. I think there's a lot of good opportunities for businesses of all sizes, as well as for personal consumers. So yeah, really pumped about the whole thing. I like how, I'm glad it finally happened, and the way that it went down. I think we got a pretty good law here.
So what do you think this is going to do for New Mexico, whether it's, for its economy, for its current crime rate and its opioid issues, or some other facet for New Mexico, Ben?
Oh, so many things. We can start with the economic impact. We're talking about 11,000 new jobs. We're talking about a new industry that in its first year could bring $30 to $40 million of revenue to the state, and that's going to be recurring revenue, which continues to grow year over year. So, a key component in helping the state move away from the boom and bust cycle of our dependence on oil and gas. And I think it is going to start to undo some of the harms of the war on drugs, which is demonstrably racist and, based in making immigrants look bad and based in, frankly, I'm just going to say the thing, based in white supremacy. So I think that doing it the way that we did it, which is legislatively, and we were set to be the third state to do it. I think we were the fourth because New York beat us to the punch by a few hours. So we took the hard way of legalizing cannabis, which is to do it legislatively instead of via ballot measure, which we really don't have a good mechanism for in New Mexico. And the result is we were able to really fine tune this legislation to be what's right for New Mexico across several different spectrums, right? Across economics, across socioeconomic, across, creating genuine and authentic opportunities for New Mexicans to enter into the business and be successful. And, again, this was the work of Representative Javier Martinez, Representative Andrea Romero, Representative Debbie Armstrong, but so many other legislators. There were three distinct bills that were introduced originally, two introduced by Democratic lawmakers and one introduced by a Republican. And what we saw through the process of the regular session is the best components of all these different bills, the best thinking around how to make a recreational cannabis market in New Mexico work for New Mexico kind of came together. And, you, Carlos, you said we were all disappointed when it stalled out in the 60-day session. And I'm just so grateful and proud of our governor for calling this special session and putting cannabis on the call, because really, this is a really incredibly difficult thing to do, and we just ran out of time at the end of the session. And I'm completely excited for this bill. It does the crucial first step of legalizing cannabis, which, the real work starts now. There's going to be future pieces of legislation, a lot more discussions in the roundhouse and in the legislative session, and a lot of work from Regulation and Licensing Department, Superintendent Linda Trujillo and her team in the rulemaking process. And we've gotten over this first hurdle. And I think it means a lot to New Mexico that we're not at the very end of the line. We lost out to Arizona. Mexico is about to legalize. Of course, Canada is Canada has already had a legal cannabis market for some time. So whereas our state or our country is going to be the last in North America to legalize cannabis on a federal level, New Mexico is not left behind. And we have this opportunity to really create a recreational cannabis industry before it's federally legalized, so that we can make sure that we know what's going to be working right for New Mexico, not only when we have our first sale in April of next year, but for the next several years as we continue to, roll back prohibition on this plant that has been made illegal for nefarious reasons. I'm excited.
Brett, I believe you practice criminal law up north also. I think you're in Las Vegas, New Mexico. Do you think that this new bill will have an effect on the drug offense type cases that you've seen or dealt with in the past?
Yes, and I do. I first wanted to second everything Ben said about the bill itself, and particularly in regards to the criminal justice side and the impacts there. One of the things that I think is kind of twofold, right? I think there's some good research out there that that when people have access to legal cannabis, their use of opioids and potential problematic use can go down. So I think there's a potential to help our health outcomes from that sense, but also from a criminal defense standpoint, something that I think is really critical in this bill that was really great to see it make it in there is the issue of probable cause. And like Ben mentioned, the racist war on drugs that we've been dealing with in this country for almost 100 years now. The odor of marijuana is something that any criminal defense attorney has seen too many times in police reports as a justification for essentially police harassment. If officers pull anybody over or stop anyone on the road and they say, there was an odor of marijuana, that's kind of a ticket to search or to get into people's business in a way that they are now going to be legally protected from. So this is an issue that criminal defense attorneys, we had been in discussion since it was decriminalized recently about the legal arguments there. And now it's very clearly written out in the law that the odor of marijuana, except for DWI, which is still reasonable for a DWI investigation, it can be used. But if there's no allegations or concerns about drug driving, that the odor of marijuana itself is no longer a basis for a search. So that's going to, protect particularly racial minorities, and so I think that there's a lot of upside for that. And then additionally, a major part of this is to deal with the illicit market, right? And how to provide legal access, and giving people legal access to cannabis will really, that's going to do a lot in terms of the bigger picture of crime and the fact that it's no longer a crime to go and buy cannabis or to grow your own. I think that's another really critical social justice and racial equity component to this bill that I was really happy to see, as this legislation has kind of evolved since it was first introduced several years ago. Home grow, even last year when things were very close to passing, the home grow was something that got axed as sort of a compromise. And this year, they, Representative Martinez, Representative Romero, and the rest of them that were on it, they weren't willing to compromise on that this year on the bill that actually passed. And so I think that is a critical component in terms of, people's own privacy and liberty to do what they want in their own homes, and to not be criminalized for that. So I think there's a lot of good elements in that sense in regards to the criminal side of things. Another thing I'd really like to point out is one of the big issues in similar legislation in other states that's passed previously has been this whole idea of felony exclusion for people to get involved in the legal market, and people who had been convicted, of marijuana trafficking, right, or possession with intent to distribute. In the past, in other states, that had been an automatic disqualifier for them to be able to obtain a license. Whereas in this New Mexico legislation, it's no longer felony convictions are something that can be considered, which I think is very reasonable, but they're not an automatic grounds for exclusion. And there's specific language in here about allowing people who have been been victims of the war on drugs and have faced the worst consequences of that, to have an avenue into the market. So I think that's just another thing to consider in the criminal justice side or social justice component, that I really credit the lawmakers for getting that in there and making that, for somebody who's been doing this illicitly to have a means to enter a legal market, I think is really important.
Much agreed. So this is kind of open to both of you. I mean, there's always going to be naysayers, negative Nancy's about the bill that's coming out. What stumbling blocks or resistance have have you experienced, or what do you see the issues towards the implementation of all the rules that need to get, drafted up are going to be facing here coming up soon?
So I think the two things that we're hearing a lot about, I'm the executive director of a statewide cannabis association. So we often look at the issue through the lens of workforce development, through economics, and through supporting businesses and bringing new businesses into this industry. So the two big things that we continue to hear about is maintaining a drug-free workplace, and that was something that was included in the bill. New Mexico is a state that is heavily reliant on federal funding between Sandia and Los Alamos National Labs and Kirtland Air Force Base. And while cannabis is still, hopefully not for too much longer, while it's still a Schedule I drug and incredibly illegal federally, there has to be a way for businesses to maintain a drug-free workplace until we see a federal legalization. So I was really grateful that other chambers of commerce across the state were very vocal and supportive of that measure. And I think in New Mexico, and I come from substance impaired driving. I'm the former executive director for Mothers Against Drunk Driving. I'm the chair of the Bernalillo County DWI planning task force right now. And I think a lot of people, mostly because of the history of DWI in New Mexico, there's a lot of concern about the substance impaired driving component. And I think the discussion there is the technology hasn't caught up. And I would argue, as somebody who's done a lot of research and really at a point in time was kind of at the forefront in different technologies to test for alcohol impairment. I think that we're never going to have a chemical test or a scientific test to test for cannabis impairment. And, and for alcohol, we have this presumed threshold where the majority of the people are impaired enough that they shouldn't be driving. And you can determine that from a blood draw or a breathalyzer, but it just doesn't work the same with cannabis. People can have THC in their system for weeks, if not months after ingesting. And there's a much bigger divergence in how much cannabis people can consume or smoke before they're impaired. So, if you think of a cancer patient who's taking, 4 grams of RSO or, some high dose of a really powerful cannabis product, they may not be impaired at all. Whereas somebody who is not a cannabis user could eat a 5 milligram gummy bear and probably shouldn't be behind the wheel. So I think, one of the things that came out in this bill is really designating funding for those drug recognition experts, which we have, I think, 300 or 400 of across the state now. And these are people who are specifically trained. It's a certification the law enforcement officers can add. They're specifically trained to do, different versions of a standard field sobriety test, looking specifically for non-alcohol impairment. And I think that's going to be ensuring that we have more drug recognition experts, ensuring that we have funding for those kind of programs is how we're going to alleviate concern about substance impaired driving. But I also think cannabis is just different from alcohol. I think there's, whereas people can get behind the wheel after going to a bar and, best laid plans to use a ride service or to take a taxi. After several drinks, people feel empowered and they make the call on their own that they're not impaired to drive. I just don't think that happens with cannabis. We don't have people going to bars and using only cannabis. There is a provision for cannabis consumption areas, which I hope we talk about later in this bill, because I think it's an interesting component of this bill. But I think there's a lot to do to kind of unpack the fear, irrational and rational, of cannabis impaired driving and the impact that's going to have in New Mexico. And I think part of that just starts with giving up with this idea that we can test cannabis impairment with a blood draw, or that there's going to be some technology similar to a breathalyzer at some point, because I just don't think there will be.
Brett, what stumbling blocks do you foresee?
Yes, two big things that I think actually were also addressed in the bill. The number one is protection of the medical program. Over the years, the medical program has had major issues with supply and shortages of medicine. That largely is not the fault of the producers, right? There's just strict limits on what the state has allowed, which has historically led to shortages, and it's gotten better in recent years. But I do think that there's very legitimate concerns from longtime patients in the program that have seen the way things have gone and are concerned that if the state goes to adult use or commercial cannabis, I like how they use that term in the legislation, that's going to negatively impact the medical program. So there are provisions, I believe, that I think address that to some degree, and it's just going to people are just going to have to see for themselves, but I do believe that the intent was to protect the medical program, and that some steps were taken for that. The other issue, kind of coupled together, is the rural versus urban kind of divide in New Mexico, and how people are the one that the rural agriculture community could be left behind in this industry when there's a great opportunity. So there are specific provisions in the bill to develop programs to encourage rural participation in the marketplace, which I think is really fantastic. And I think as they develop these rules, that it's good that it's in the statute that they have to consider this. If you look at the concentration of medical dispensaries right now, they're highly concentrated in Albuquerque, Santa Fe. But even that has improved over time as well. I live out here in a rural area, and our access has improved. There's more medical dispensaries here than there had been, and I think that there's language in the bill that they have to consider that when they're crafting these rules. And the other part that I think ties into that is this idea of local control, and some of these very very conservative places in rural New Mexico are not going to be allowed to just flat out bar legal cannabis businesses from existing, right? And I think that was a really critical part of this legislation. I think you saw that happen in Colorado. There were places that, even though it was legalized statewide, they just said, nope, we're not having it in our town, and there's nothing you can do to stop us. And it's been a long uphill battle for them to kind of turn that around. So I think to give local municipalities, cities, and counties reasonable restrictions on time, place, and manner about how these businesses can operate, without allowing them to just flat out bar it or say we're not going to allow these businesses at all, I think is a really good way that this legislation has handled those two concerns. So those are two big stumbling blocks that I've seen in the years up at the legislature, with people really concerned. And I think this bill did do some things to try to alleviate those concerns.
Fantastic. All right, we're going to take our first break now, and we will come back and talk a little bit more about the actual licensing, what's included in it, how to get into the industry itself, and everything. So please stay tuned. Okay, welcome back. Back here talking with Ben Lewinger and Brett Phelps about cannabis legalization. Now, as both of you can assume and imagine, people are extremely interested in getting into the market, getting into this industry, a very early and budding industry. When does this even start? I mean, what is the timeline that we're looking at before anybody can, start applying for these licenses? What's the status of current license holders in the industry? What type of licenses are there available for people?
So there's a calendar, a very aggressive calendar set out by RLD in this legislation to promulgate rules. and they're going to start with production licenses no later than September 1st. So one of the adjustments in one of the later versions of the legislation was they changed all the dates to no later than. So hopefully, if they can be very aggressive with promulgating rules, which is a time-consuming process, the dates can be moved up a little bit. But no later than September 1st, they are going to open up production licenses for new cannabis producers, cannabis micro producers, and then what they're calling the legacy licenses. So medical cannabis producers in good standing with DOH. And the idea in starting with those licenses is, we'll get plants in the ground with several months before the first adult use sale, so we don't run out of cannabis on day 3. And what we've seen in other states when the floodgates have been opened is you have lines out the door for several weeks after. So we want to be sure that there's an opportunity to build up supply, not just on flower, but also in distillates and other manufactured products, which, cannabis takes time to grow, it takes time to cure, and then it takes time to manufacture. So those production licenses will open up in no later than September 1st, no later than January 1st. They'll open up the full license, the full license tier as described in the legislation. So manufacturing licenses, courier license, testing facilities, all the other license types. And then the first adult use sale will be no later than April 1st of next year.
Now, there's reading the bill, it says something in here about micro businesses, and it differentiates that. What are micro businesses? What do they include, I guess, and what are any sort of limits or caps that they may be facing for that particular license type?
So the micro business license was one of the components that Representative Martinez and the other legislators on the bill were really pushing to encourage small businesses to be able to get involved in this. Right, historically, when states have come on board with full adult use legalization, there's been a huge barrier to entry in terms of the money that you have to put up front. So this is an opportunity to help level the playing field there. And what a micro business production license allows an individual to grow or a business to grow up to 200 plants. And if you're going for the full production license, there's also some fees associated with each plant, so that your fees are going to scale up based on the size of your operation. But these micro businesses, they're able to grow up to 200 plants. It's, I believe, let me take a look here. I got the numbers right in front of me. I can give you the exact number. Yes. So for the micro business, they're looking at $1,000 a year for their licensing and no plant fees on top of that. So that's a very reasonable way to enter the market for small businesses, particularly people who, if you're looking at a craft or a boutique kind of operation, right? I think it's very comparable to the brewers licenses and the small breweries that have really flourished in New Mexico at a small scale. Right, we've got dozens and dozens of breweries around the state that aren't producing a whole lot, but they are producing really high quality. So I think the micro businesses are a really great opportunity there with low overhead. I think that's a great way for people who maybe have been doing this on the illicit side that want to actually go legit without having to, have a whole team of investors and a huge infrastructure in place. If you've got a small family farm, this is a really easy way to get into that. I also commend as Ben described it, an aggressive timeline on this to start with. Starting September 1st is when they're going to start accepting applications. Now, whether that means, it's going to be on September 1st that they actually put the guidelines out for what all needs to be in an application, or if that's going to be hopefully well before that. And beginning of September, people are actually able to start submitting them and knowing what they need to do. But I like the way that they've approached this, and that they're gonna look at those licenses first, as Ben said, get plants in the ground, really try to get the supply side going, and then deal with the retail and how you're actually going to get it to the consumers. But if we don't have the production happening, it's going to be a mess come April of next year when sales are supposed to start.
And if I could just, there are actually two types of the micro business license. There's the producer license, which has a fee of $1,000 growing up to 200 plants. And then there's also an integrated micro license, which you can grow. It's the same plant count, 200 plants, but you can also do like some manufacturing light procedures, no ethanol extraction, but you can make edibles and do other, make other products, cold press rosin, other products that don't include the highest level of manufacturing. And those are $2,500 a piece. And they also allow for a single retail location. And you can add additional retail locations for $500 a year. And, for a lot of people, I think these micro businesses, that could be it. That could be your business. A well-run micro business could produce pretty significant revenue. And like Brett talked about, if you're already a farmer and you just want to designate some of your alfalfa land to either setting up a greenhouse or doing an outdoor grow, this could be your business. Or it could be an avenue to the higher tiers of licensure. So I think, this was a really smart approach. This is a really smart way of addressing what in other states have been called equity licensing programs. And it, really creates those authentic engagement points and authentic entry points for New Mexicans. And I'm just really excited for these micro businesses. And at the Chamber, we're working on programming now to help micro businesses to apply for their application, to do some mentoring type of programming with existing license holders in the medical program. And one thing that Brett said at the beginning, and then you just mentioned it again, this is really important because there have been people who have been producing cannabis for years, who are amazing growers, amazing manufacturers, and they've been underground. And now that it's legal, for so many years, Humboldt County in California was like the epicenter of cannabis. And this little county was supplying cannabis really for the entire country. And there were, smaller grow operations in other states, including in New Mexico. But I think this is a really key part in how do we create a situation or a set of circumstances where people have been good operators in an illegal market. How can we create an opportunity for those same operators to really thrive in what's now a legal market? And I think these micro licenses are a really well thought out and well-intentioned tool to do that.
I really agree with that. And one thing I was happy about too to see was, as I was going through this, is that there's not a limit to the amount of licenses that can be in one facility or in one permitted area. So I think there's some real opportunities here for micro businesses to kind of possibly team up or be able to utilize shared resources in that way. If you have a centralized kind of distribution point or manufacturing point that, similar to a food co-op or something like that. I know up in Taos, they have like a community kitchen, right? That businesses are able to use. And I think with, there's opportunities there, particularly in these rural areas where, you can get to some of the better economies of scale with multiple micro licenses, in a community. So I think there's just a lot of really, really good opportunities for people statewide to get involved at that level, and either stick to it at that level, like Ben said, or if that's your dream to grow into something really big, you can start with that. And if things go well, you can scale up to the bigger license. But I'm especially excited about those. I think that's something that has not been handled as well in other states. So a lot of credit to the people who got that in there and how they made that happen.
So looking at the provisions of the bill, and it looks like there's 12 different licenses or permits that they're going to allow. I mean, number one is cannabis consumption area. And I know this was mentioned a little earlier by by Ben, but what is a cannabis consumption area? I mean, and what, I guess, are the benefits of it? What are the cons of it? I mean, what exactly would I be doing if I was going to visit a cannabis consumption area?
Yeah, so I think this is something that came up in this bill, and Representative Javier Martinez. So to answer your question, a cannabis consumption area is a place where people can go and consume cannabis. And rules were promulgated for cannabis consumption areas in the medical program last year, and we have yet to see the first cannabis consumption area. And I think a big part of that is, at least for our members at the chamber, the operators in the medical cannabis program are scared of taking on the risk of having a cannabis consumption area. And I think a lot of that goes to, to the DWI argument I was just saying. If there is any real danger of substance impaired driving from cannabis, I think it's potentially a cannabis consumption area where somebody who is inexperienced goes and consumes too much, and then they're not at home and they need to get home. But Representative Javier Martinez raised a really excellent point several times during the session that these cannabis consumption areas, this is part of the social and restorative justice of the bill. There are people who, rent, there are people in transitional living situations who aren't able to publicly consume cannabis. They aren't able to consume cannabis in their living arrangement. And so this is a really key part in opening up cannabis for every New Mexican. And I know that there probably are some operators now, and there probably some future applicants who are interested in doing cannabis consumption areas for that reason. But also we're starting to see these pop up in California, where it's like a boutique experience, where people, restaurant operators, bars are creating an experience around cannabis. So say you have a restaurant that wants to do a 7-course meal for $4.20, and they want to do cannabis pairings with their food, and this kind of opens it up to that. So I think this was kind of similar to home grows. This was one of the inclusions in the bill that I think raised concern. I think it could have been maybe one of the poison pills that some legislators really latched onto, and they didn't want the bill to pass for this reason. But hearing Representative Martinez talk about how these consumption areas are a social justice initiative, I'm really glad that they're included in there. I don't know if it's something that we'll see anytime soon, but as the industry in New Mexico quickly matures and continues to grow, and there's more of an outcry and a desire from consumers for these cannabis consumption areas, I think that we'll start to see people apply for these license types.
Just a couple things to add on that. I really like the way Ben kind of described it. One, important to note that the one restriction on cannabis consumption areas is that they cannot also serve alcohol. So that is something that's key in terms of if you're trying to picture in your head what this might look like. It's not going to be your regular, raging bar scenario where they're also able to pass around joints or something like that, right? It's going to be a strictly cannabis, more similar to like a cigar bar type scenario. So I want to make sure that people understand that. And also, if we're looking at this realistically, like New Mexico is looking to draw in cannabis tourism, and people coming across the border from El Paso, from Amarillo, from Oklahoma, and realistically, right, this was one of the biggest things that they ran into in Colorado when they first started adult use sales there. Is people would go there, they'd go to the dispensaries, they'd buy what they, all the things they wanted to try, and then if they're staying in a hotel, most hotels don't allow smoking, and almost all of them don't allow cannabis smoking. So they would have this product and they have nowhere to use it. And so that leads to a proliferation of public cannabis consumption, which I think most of the opponents of this bill would argue is a kind of worse scenario, to have everybody out smoking it on the street or in their cars, because that's realistically, the place that they where they are able to consume. So I think, particularly, people that live in apartments, people that live in close housing situations, or people that just don't own their own homes might not have that freedom. But also, if we're realistically looking at, cannabis tourism as an economic driver, tourists are going to need a place to consume. And so I think that it's going to be interesting to see how these develop, because there hasn't been much traction on the medical side, although they did allow the rules for that. And it's going to be interesting to see how different localities kind of handle that, and the zoning. They obviously, they're going to have to follow the Indoor Clean Air Act in New Mexico, which will provide a whole another kind of litany of challenges for people interested in getting involved in this. But I think it's something that is critical in terms of, if we really want to be realistic about what our market is going to look like, and how people are going to be consuming these products, to have a designated consumption area is better for safety. And even in regards to the DWI and that type of thing, if you're in a controlled environment, the same way a bartender cuts you off when you've had too much to drink, or is going to, to have responsibilities to prevent people from driving or behaving in an unsafe way, having a controlled cannabis consumption area allows that same opportunity, right? You can have kind of eyes on people. You can see if people, how they're doing, and kind of put a little bit more control on that, or at least help people out that might need the help. If you need to call a ride for somebody, it's a lot easier to do that in an environment like that than if they're just out on their own.
I'm really glad that you mentioned the tourism piece, Brett, because we were, there were some numbers being thrown around. And I think there was a lot of urgency, and we saw this with the call for the special session to beat Texas, right? We had to legalize before Texas. There's legislation in the Texas House now that seems to be gaining some momentum. I'm not sure if it'll pass in the next year or the next 2 years. But if you look at the New Mexico's border with Texas, and you think about going into the state of Texas by 20 miles, the length of that entire border, it nearly doubles the consumer base for New Mexico cannabis. So that tourism opportunity, especially on the eastern side of the state, is very, very real. And I agree with you that consumption areas are an important part of that. And I'm glad you brought it up.
So to all this talk about cannabis consumption, these retail spaces, how old does somebody have to be to come and participate in New Mexico's program once it gets going?
It's going to be 21, similar to alcohol, except if you're enrolled in the medical program, which that's the way the program is now. There will be still provisions if you have a legitimate medical need and you're under 21, you can still become enrolled in the medical program. But to just be able to walk in the store off the street, have to be 21 years of age. Same as selling alcohol, right? They're very diligent in checking IDs. That's something that will be, they'll have to take serious. It's not, it's not something that they can, say there's going to be eyes on these people, and checking IDs and doing that in a legitimate way is definitely going to be an important part of businesses being able to operate. Would also point out, and for people with those concerns, that there are limits on marketing and advertising. Specifically, there are provisions that advertising cannot be geared towards children, cannot be designed to market to children. There's limits on where advertising can go up. It can't be around schools or daycares. So it is for legitimate adult use, and 21 was the agreed upon age. They said if that's good for alcohol, that would work for cannabis.
Yeah, there was discussion with legislators between the 2020 session and the session that we just got out of about possibly having the age for cannabis be 25, because there's a growing amount of evidence that some key brain development is still happening into your mid-20s, and that very heavy cannabis use can have some potentially harmful impacts on the brain of a 22 or even a 23-year-old. So there was discussion about trying to push the age to 25, but like Brett said, it just seemed everybody is used to 21 for alcohol, And it seemed like that was probably the easier pill to swallow. And, with adult use sales of cannabis, that's going to create a lot of funding for prevention activities in counties and municipalities across the state to do that education, to educate people that heavy cannabis use, unless you're using it in a medical setting, is probably not the best thing, especially if you're in your early 20s.
So how much am I limited to buying? Let's say I'm Joe Texan and I'm coming into New Mexico to go get into one of these stores. Am I able to buy pounds? I mean, everything's bigger in Texas. I'm sure they would like to take bags back, but I mean, what are the limits that are put on consumers?
So this one is going to be kind of interesting to see how it's promulgated in the rules, because there's not limits in the legislation about how much you can buy at one time. What there are limits on is how much you can possess in public. And that's going to be 2 ounces of flour. For those that aren't super familiar, that's maybe 2 Ziploc sandwich baggies full, give or take. And about 16 grams of cannabis concentrate, and I think 800 milligrams worth of THC in edibles. So it's important to note that the legislation was very specific about that's what you're allowed to have on your person out in public. What you can have in your home is, as long as it's locked away in a safe place, not available to public view, there's really no limits there. So I imagine the sales, it's not going to be more than 2 ounces. It's not going to be more than 16 grams of concentrate. Whether they limit it to less than that, I think would probably be more based on the supply side to start, would be my guess. If they're worried about supply issues, they might limit it there. But my guess would be you're probably going to be limited to something in, if supply is not an issue, my guess would be a 2 ounces. But Ben, maybe you have anything else on that?
No, I think, you said it, the legislation is very clear. Possessing 2 ounces, 16 grams of extract, and 800 milligrams of edible. And then there's no prohibition on possessing more. It just has to be kept in your private residence, not visible from a public place. And one of the TV stations went to a dispensary and had them lay out on a table what that amount, what that looks like, what 2 ounces of flour, 16 grams of extract, and 800 milligrams of edibles look like. And it's a lot. Somebody could come over from Texas, make a pretty big purchase, and then of course legally they're not allowed to bring it back into Texas, but at that point it's up to Texas law and Texas law enforcement to deal with that. But the possession amounts are a lot, and I think part of that is making sure that we're all making good on the governor's promise of protecting and enhancing the medical cannabis program. So for some medical cannabis patients, this may not be a lot. This may be a week's supply or a couple weeks supply. And it's really important, if you're somebody who relies on cannabis for your medicine, that you're able to take advantage of bulk discounts of different sales. And I think a lot of thinking went into these possession limits. And I'm glad that they weren't more conservative like we've seen in other states.
Yeah, just one other little point on that. I do think, it's a pretty reasonable sized amount. And I think it's also really important if we're looking at kind of the rural equity, right? If I live out in Roy, New Mexico, and I got to drive, an hour or 2 hours to get to, a dispensary, to be able to get yourself a decent amount of supply, I think is important as well. So looking at it from that standpoint as well, I think these are pretty reasonable amounts. I think this is it's more than what you were allowed to possess in Colorado when they passed theirs. It was 1 ounce when they first passed that. So yeah, I would agree with all that, and I think it's a good limit that they set there.
All right, guys, we're going to take our second break now. We'll come back and we'll talk a little more on the social justice and social equity portions of the bill. Then we'll go ahead and close it out. Be right back. All right, everybody, welcome back. Thank you for sticking with us. The Cannabis Law Section's podcast, talking here with Ben Lewinger, the Executive Director of the New Mexico Cannabis Chamber of Commerce. And we're also talking with Brett Phelps, cannabis law attorney, criminal law attorney. Gentlemen, so with the new legislation, with the new bill, with the recreational, there's a lot of concern about the Linen and Compassionate Use Act either being left in the cold or not being taken care of. What protections in this bill deal with, the medical patients, the medical program as it is now?
So maybe I could start, and Brett, then you can kind of fill in some of the details. I think New Mexico was the first state to have a medical cannabis program serving 600 cancer patients back in the 70s. And we have one of the most robust and vibrant medical cannabis programs now in the country. And I want to be very clear, above all else, cannabis is medicine. I really reject the notion that cannabis belongs in the same category as alcohol or tobacco. It's definitely an intoxicating substance, but for so many people, including the 100,000 people enrolled in our medical cannabis program now in New Mexico, but also for people not enrolled in the cannabis who have been using cannabis illegally to treat symptoms like, not being able to sleep, anxiety, stress. I think cannabis, above all else, is medicine. And I think that, some of the provisions in here protecting patient supply, I think that's really important. And I think it's important that also we don't be Pollyannish about what the move to adult use cannabis means in New Mexico with the medical cannabis market. So first, I said 100,000 patients, but truthfully, the medical cannabis program in New Mexico is serving more than 100,000 patients. There are definitely people who didn't qualify for, they didn't meet the qualifications in terms of having one of the qualifying conditions or otherwise just didn't enroll in the medical cannabis program. And medical cannabis in New Mexico still serves those people. So medical cannabis is serving a patient population now greater than 100,000 people. We also can't be Pollyannish that every medical cannabis state that has shifted to adult use, the numbers in the medical cannabis program in those states have declined. And that's just because sometimes it's easier or more cost effective just to buy cannabis recreationally like everybody else. So I think the two big things in the bill are protecting patient supply, and there's a bunch of different provisions, including making new license holders only cater to patients for the 6 months. Licensees can serve only the medical cannabis program, but they can't serve only the adult use program. So if you're a license holder, you have to serve the medical program. And the big thing is removing GRT and not charging this cannabis excise tax on medical products. So the medicine will be cheaper, and that's a really good incentive to stay in the medical program. I've been in the medical cannabis program for 5 or 6 years. I have a really aggressive form of autoimmune arthritis. That's my qualifying condition. And from my perspective, I will definitely stay enrolled in the medical cannabis program. And I hope that we see enhancements in terms of, different kinds of products. I think suppositories, inhalers, I think there's a variety of products that patients want and will continue to desire aside from an adult use market. And I think there are definitely ways to continue to not just sustain, but really enhance and grow the medical cannabis program. But we definitely expect to see a decrease in numbers, at least initially, because that's what we've seen in every other state. So that should not be cause for alarm initially.
Yes, I would agree with that. I think that the legislation does some things to incentivize people to stay in the program, specifically the taxes, and that'll be significant. There was a short period of time last year where a court had ruled that those taxes were no longer required on the medicine, and prices dropped substantially. another court overruled that, and the taxes eventually came back. But there was a short period of time, and it was a very significant difference that you can see there. So I think hopefully that will encourage people that are in the medical program now to stay in it, to keep that afloat. But also one thing that I thought was interesting in the legislation is that the Cannabis Control Division, the specific language is that they'll initially take reasonable measures to expeditiously incentivize increased production of cannabis plants to remedy a shortage of cannabis supply in the medical program. So they want to not only incentivize patients to stay in the program, but incentivize producers to keep that supply on the medical side. So like I said, I think those were well-founded concerns by the longtime patients in the program. But hopefully that and some of the set-asides of the supply has to be there. There's a minimum amount that has to stay on the medical side. We'll keep those there and hopefully some incentives to keep people in the program and keep it thriving, because it, as Ben said, we were the first state to pass it back in the 70s. We were also the first state to have a state regulated medical cannabis market back after that passed in 2007. Other states had done it before us, but we were the first ones to actually have state licenses and have a program run that way. So I hope that that those concerns are alleviated and that the medical program is able to continue providing that medicine.
So for those that aren't in the medical program or who don't necessarily want to frequent a retail store, and I think we touched on this earlier, are they able to grow their own cannabis plants? And if so, are there any limits associated with those?
Yeah, so they are, and this is something that had been a sticking point in an earlier concession in the bill in previous years, but this year you're allowed to grow at your own residence up to 6 mature plants and 6 immature plants if you're growing on a staggered cycle, which for personal use is a sufficient amount. For more than one person in the household, you can have up to 12 mature plants in a household, which I think is really fantastic, really critical to one is as sort of a social justice aspect of this, right? You're not dependent on a store the same way you can brew beer in your garage. But you can't set up a full-blown distillery, right, to do the hardcore extraction where there's potential health and safety risks. Same thing with cannabis, right? You can grow your plants. For people that are concerned, it will still be illegal to be doing solvent extractions. Really the type of thing that when it's done in a home setting, there are legitimate risks. You've seen it happen when you're dealing with that type of thing. But for the basic growing, people are going to be able to do that, and they're not going to have to rely on a store. But not everyone wants to do that. Not everyone's able to do that. So they can, stores are there for people who want them. But I think that's a fantastic provision in the bill to allow those 6 plants at home grow.
And when you're able to grow these, are you able to grow these in view of, traffic, in view of your neighbors? Is that going to cause any issues with law enforcement?
I think the legislation says that they can't be in public view. And I think a lot of the details specifically around this, and really a lot of the details around how we move forward and regulate this industry is going to be in the rulemaking. And I think that it was a smart move to really empower a rulemaking body to have oversight and responsibility for that part of how we move into a legal market. But, and I think that's as much for the safety of people who want to take advantage of the home grow provisions as anything else. And I'm trying to find the section now, but I do remember that it said it couldn't be in public view.
So we have this new market coming to town. We have the medical market currently in effect. What are the implications on the black market? How do you feel that this is going to affect it? Is it going to affect it? What are your thoughts?
I think the hope is for everyone that this is really gonna diminish the strength of the illicit market, and really it's never going to go away. To say at this until there's federal legalization and everyone across the country has equitable access, it's going to be there. So to use that as kind of a detraction from the bill, I think it's just unrealistic. But I do think that they've set the barriers to entry low enough that people who want to get involved from going from the illicit to the legal market have that opportunity. I think that the ability for people to do their own home grow as well will really eliminate a lot of that. But to say realistically that it's going to 100% wipe it out, then as long as we got Oklahoma and Texas next door with their restrictions, and other places like that, it's not going to go away entirely. But I do think that this will have a major impact and really cut down on the incentives of people to be involved in the illicit market.
Gentlemen, I want to thank you both today for participating in the podcast. Greatly appreciated. I hope our listeners learned a little, maybe a lot about the bill. Pretty exciting. Do you guys have any closing thoughts?
So one thing we didn't get to touch on was the sister bill to the actual legalization, and that had to do with expungement of past criminal convictions for crimes that would now be allowed under this legislation. I know that was a sticking point for a lot of legislators that said that they didn't want to have it all together in that. So if that's the way that it got done, it got done. I think that's really great that people are going to be able to have those criminal records cleared and hopefully address some of the issues of the war on drugs. Right. This is an equity issue. This is a social justice issue, a racial justice issue, and that sister legislation for the expungement was another critical component of that. So really, I applaud the legislators. I shouted out some before, but again, Senator Jerry Ortiz-Pino is somebody who's been bringing this for years and years and years. His name wasn't attached. He wasn't a sponsor on this one, but he was a huge supporter. Now Secretary Bill McCamley, when he was in the House of Representatives, he brought this legislation forward for several years. So really, a lot of credit to them, a lot of credit to Drug Policy Alliance, the people there that have been advocating for this for years. All the citizen advocates, the organizations that have been up there. I've been at the Roundhouse with y'all and seeing the work that people have put in. And so yeah, I'm super thrilled. This is what got me into this was I dealt with getting arrested for cannabis possession back when I was a teenager, and that really spurred my interest in it. How do we make this better? And to see where things have come from, that was back in 2004, to see where things have come from then and all the hard work that people have put in for years and years to get it there, to finally see it go over the line, to make it over the line. Credit to the governor for calling this special session. Whoever, got her to really go on that, I really commend them. All the senators who spoke passionately about, the need for this beyond just the economics of it, right? The economics are easy to get behind, but to really push it as more than that. Give everybody a lot of credit to Ben and the advocacy that him and his group has done, and the medical providers that have, been doing this for a long time. Really excited for people to get involved. Really excited to see what comes out of these rules and applications. And would just say I would be more than happy to help anybody, get involved that wants to take part in this industry. It can be anything from very small scale to very large scale. So there's no there's just a ton of opportunity. I'm super excited. I think that this is a really solid bill, one of the best in the country that's been passed. So just tons of credit to everyone that made it happen. And here we are, people have, so much credit to the generations before that were, fighting this since before I was born. So just a lot of credit to everyone there. I'm super thrilled to, have played a tiny part in this whole discussion and to have been involved and to see it get over the line. And now we got a lot of opportunities. We've got, a lot of fun to look forward to. I'm sure there will be headaches. It's not going to be perfect. Would encourage everyone to be patient and understanding, the people that are behind this really want to see it succeed. So just really, congrats to everyone for getting it done. Can't wait to actually see the governor put her pen to it and sign it onto the books and rocking and rolling. Come September, applications are going to be coming in. So, I'd be happy to help anybody out that wants to get involved at any level. So thanks again for having me. I could talk about this all day. And it's really been a pleasure. And I'm glad that we have so many good things to say about the bill and what got done. So thanks for the opportunity. Looking forward to seeing what New Mexico does with it now.
Yeah, everything Brett said. I think, I've been working behind the scenes on lots of different initiatives in the Roundhouse for the last decade. And I think this is the single most important piece of legislation that I've seen passed in terms of New Mexico having the ability to really define and create and map out its own future. I think that passing this bill is the first big hurdle. We still have a lot of work to do in future legislative sessions, in the rulemaking process. But getting this over the finish line is huge for New Mexico. And I think we've done it in a way that, honors our agrarian heritage, that really honors the fact that New Mexico kind of looks like what the rest of the country is going to look like in 20 years. And I'm just really excited to help to create these opportunities to build this industry that's by New Mexicans, for New Mexicans, and to not be the last in the country to do it. I think that lots of states are gonna have their eyes on how we do this and how we roll this out. And I have complete faith. There will be speed bumps and there will be stumbling blocks, but I have complete faith that this is the start of something that's going to be really big and really important and really good for New Mexico as a state.
Awesome. Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Brett. I also want to thank Morgan from the State Bar and all she does for our section. I want to thank the Cannabis Law Section. If you haven't joined, go join. You don't have to be a lawyer to join. Thanks to everybody. And until next time, hope you guys have a great day.
Thank you for listening. This episode was produced by the State Bar of New Mexico's Member Services Department in the Cannabis Law Section. All editing and sound mixing was done by Blue Sky eLearn. Intro music is by Kevin McLeod at Incomtech. The views of the presenters are that of their own and not endorsed by the State Bar of New Mexico. Nothing said in this podcast